Alfred Yarborough was 31 years old when he first understood what the filing cabinet meant. It was a gray metal cabinet, 4 drawers tall, sitting in the corner of the small office off the kitchen in the farmhouse where he had grown up. He had walked past it 10,000 times. He had opened it to look for a pen, to find an insurance document, to check a seed receipt his father needed. He had never read it. On a cold morning in January of 2014, with his father out checking the east field after an overnight freeze, Alfred opened the top drawer and pulled out a folder at random. The label on the tab read Eastfield Wheat Yield 1961. The handwriting was not his father's. It was small and precise and slanted slightly to the left, the writing of a man who had learned penmanship in a one-room schoolhouse in Fillmore County, Nebraska, sometime around 1920. Alfred read the page. It was a single sheet of graph paper ruled by hand into columns. Date, field, soil condition notes, yield per acre, rainfall for the month. A brief observation at the bottom in the same precise hand. Dry summer but east section held moisture better than expected. Drainage holding. Worth noting for next year. Alfred stood in the office for a long moment. Then he opened the drawer below it and pulled out another folder. This one was labeled the same way as same field, same crop, but the year was 1988. The handwriting was different. Larger, more angular, written faster. His father's hand. The columns were the same. The observations at the bottom were the same kind of careful, practical notation. And tucked inside the folder behind the graph paper was a smaller sheet in his father's writing that read, D. Honeyut kept this same record from 1948. Continuing his system, do not change the format. 2 men, 30 years apart, the same field, the same questions asked of the same ground in the same way because one of them had decided the land deserved to be known that carefully, and the other had agreed. Alfred put the folder back. He closed the drawer. He stood in the corner of that small office and understood for the first time with his whole body, rather than just his mind, what it had taken to build what he was standing inside. To understand the filing cabinet, you have to understand Dwayne Honeyut first. And to understand Dwayne Honeyut, you have to understand why a man who farmed the same 480 acres for 40 years could reach the end of his life without a single person to leave it to, and why that absence shaped every decision he made in the last decade he had left. Dwayne Honeyut was born in 1910 in Fillmore County, Nebraska, the second son of a man who had broken the first sod on 320 acres of rolling dry land in 1921. By the time Dwayne was old enough to work alongside his father, the land was already shaping itself around the habits of the family that farmed it. The Honeyuts were not demonstrative people. They did not talk about what the land meant to them. They showed it through the decisions they made when no one was watching, through the money they spent on improvements that would not pay off for a decade, through the hours they put in on machinery and fences and soil that did not need to be as good as they made it, but that they made that good anyway because the alternative did not occur to them. Dwayne expanded the operation to 480 acres in 1955, buying the adjacent quarter section from a neighbor who was retiring and who trusted Dwayne to keep it well. Dwayne did keep it well. He kept everything well, not because people were watching, but because the work itself demanded it. In 1963, Dwayne installed tile drainage on the low sections of the east field. This was not a common decision in Fillmore County that year. The system involved perforated clay pipes buried several feet below the surface, running water away from the root zone during wet periods and toward it during dry ones, regulating the moisture balance of the soil in a way that no amount of surface work could replicate. The cost was significant. The payoff was invisible for years. His neighbor Preston Childers, who farmed 200 acres directly to the north, stood at the fence line and watched Dwayne's crew dig and shook his head. Preston was 55 years old and had been farming Fillmore County ground his entire adult life. He was not a foolish man. He was a practical man who had learned to distrust expensive solutions to problems that had not yet become catastrophic. Dwayne, Preston said, that ground hasn't flooded bad enough in 20 years to need what you're putting in it. You're spending money on a problem you don't have. Dwayne looked at his neighbor. He did not argue. Dwayne Honeyut did not argue about land decisions because he had found that arguments about land decisions were almost always settled by the land itself eventually, and it was better to wait for that settlement than to spend energy on words. He went back to work. 5 years later, in the spring of 1968, 2 consecutive wet seasons pushed water across most of Fillmore County. Fields that had drained adequately in normal years sat under standing water for weeks. Preston Childer's north sections were underwater for most of May. His wheat rotted in the ground. Dwayne's east field drained clean within 48 hours of the last rain. Preston Childers walked over to the fence line and stood there for a long time looking at Dwayne's field, which was green and standing, and then at his own, which was brown and flat and silent in the wind of things that had died quietly. He did not apologize. Men in Fillmore County in 1968 did not apologize about farming decisions because farming decisions were made in good faith with the information available, and there was no moral failure in being wrong about the weather. But he stood at that fence for a long time, and when he finally spoke, he said only, "Next year I'm putting tile in the north section." Dwayne nodded. That was enough. What Dwayne could not fix with all his competence and all his careful management was the question that Fillmore County did not ask out loud, but that everyone understood was coming: who would take care of the land when Dwayne was gone? Dwayne Honeyut and his wife Evelyn had tried to have children. This is the quiet tragedy at the center of the story, and it deserves to be said plainly, rather than in the soft language people use for things they find uncomfortable. Evelyn had been pregnant twice in the 1940s. Neither pregnancy went to term. By 1952, they had stopped trying, and by 1955, they had stopped talking about it, and by 1960, the subject had become one of those permanent absences in a marriage that couples learn to live around rather than through. Fillmore County understood. Nobody asked. But the land did not understand. The land only knew that it was being cared for by a man who was getting older, and that the care it received was the kind that accumulated across generations rather than within them, and that without someone to continue it, 40 years of Dwayne Honeyut's attention would begin to unwind the moment he stopped being there to provide it. Dwayne Honeyut opened his filing cabinet every spring and every fall to record what the land had done and what had been done to it. He had kept these records since 1948, written in that small, precise hand on graph paper he ordered specially from a supplier in Lincoln. Soil condition, yield, rainfall, input costs, observations. The records were not required by anyone. No bank demanded them. No government program tracked them. Dwayne kept them because he believed the land deserved to be known that well, and because he suspected somewhere in the part of him that thought about the future more than he let on, that someone would need them someday. He just did not know who. 4 miles east of the Honeyut farm, on a smaller operation with thinner margins and older equipment, Conrad Yarro was raising 3 children on 160 acres of corn ground, and the kind of persistent financial pressure that does not break a man all at once, but accumulates year by year into a specific exhaustion that people who have never felt it tend to mistake for contentment. Conrad was a good farmer. He knew his soil, knew his equipment, knew his neighbors and his county and the rhythms of planting and harvest that structured his year. His decisions were sound. His work was honest. The problem was not his competence. The problem was arithmetic. 160 acres of corn ground with a machinery loan at 8% interest and input costs that rose every year left margins thin enough that a single bad season could erase three good ones. Conrad Yarbrough had lived inside that arithmetic for 15 years by the time 1973 arrived, and he had learned to make his peace with it in the way that practical men make peace with things they cannot change, by focusing on what was within his control and not spending energy on what was not. In November of 1973, Conrad's neighbor, Quimby Quarles, came over after supper with a proposal. Quimby was 45, optimistic in the way of men who have not yet been seriously wrong, and he had his eye on an 80-acre parcel that an older farmer 2 miles south was willing to rent at reasonable rates. "Conrad, I'm telling you, this is a good opportunity," Quimby said, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. "We split the rent, we split the crop, we split the cost of working it. The ground is decent. Johnson's been farming it conservative for 30 years, which means there's yield in it we haven't seen yet." Conrad listened. He had already done the arithmetic in his head before Quimby finished the sentence, because Conrad Yarbrough was the kind of man who did arithmetic continuously the way other people breathed. He knew what the additional rent would cost per month. He knew what his current loan payments were. He knew that his operating margin for the last year had been thin enough that an 8-inch rain at the wrong time in August could have pushed him into a conversation with his bank that he did not want to have. He said no. Quimby was disappointed but not surprised. He rented the parcel himself alone, confident that the numbers would work. The following summer, 1974, brought a dry stretch through July and August that cut yield across the county. Quimby Quarles harvested 30% less than he had projected. The rent still came due. He covered it, but only by taking a short-term loan that cost him more in interest than he had made on the extra ground. Conrad Yarbrough broke even that year. Not ahead, not behind, even. Kellum Yarbrough was 12 years old in November of 1973 and had been doing homework at the corner of the kitchen table during his father's conversation with Quimby Quarles. He did not understand all of the numbers. He understood enough. He understood that his father was turning down an opportunity because the downside risk was real and the margin for error was narrow. And that caution was the only tool available when all the other tools were already in use. He understood something else too, without being able to say it, that his father was right, and that being right was not enough to change the larger picture. Conrad Yarbrough could make every correct decision available to him within the constraints of 160 acres and borrowed equipment and interest payments that never got smaller, and he would end every year in roughly the position he had started it. Kellum did not want that life, not because his father's life was shameful or wrong, because he wanted more ground under his feet when he was done, and more certainty, and more of the permanence that land owned without debt could provide. He was 12 years old when he understood this. He would not act on it for 2 more years. But the understanding itself had already settled into place. The August afternoon that changed everything arrived in 1974, during the same dry summer that had cost Quimby Quarles his margin. Kellum was 14 years old and had spent the morning helping Quimby clear broken equipment from a field that had yielded less than anyone hoped. He was riding his bicycle home on the county road that ran along the eastern fence line of the Honeyut farm, heading back to his family's place 4 miles east. The sky was the flat blue of a Nebraska summer afternoon, pale and absolute, and the heat was the kind that sits on the back of your neck like a hand. He came around a slight bend in the road, and the east field of the Honeyut farm opened up to his left. The wheat was late in the ripening because Dwayne's tile drainage had kept the soil moisture more stable during the dry weeks, and the crop stood at chest height in the way of wheat grown on ground that had been properly cared for. It ran to the west fence line in a straight line that only good soil and a careful farmer could produce. The color was the green that becomes gold, the edge of ripeness, the moment just before the harvest, that a good crop holds briefly like a person taking a breath before doing something difficult. Kellum stopped his bicycle. There was no reason to stop that he could have explained to anyone. He put his foot down on the road and held the handlebars and looked through the fence at Dwayne Honeyut's east field for approximately 3 minutes. He did not think, "I want this." He did not think, "I will try for this." What moved through his mind was quieter and more certain than either of those things. It was the recognition that he was looking at what he was going to own someday. Not hope, not ambition, recognition. The way you recognize your own name when someone says it in a crowd. This was the land he would farm. He just had not paid for it yet. He got back on his bicycle and rode home. He did not tell his father. He did not tell his mother. He did not tell his friends. He had decided without being fully aware that he was deciding it, that the kind of goal requiring 8 years of quiet work was the kind that survived better in silence than in conversation. There would be nothing to show for years. There would be no progress visible to anyone but himself. And the only thing worse than having a goal that seemed impossible was having it examined by people who could see all the reasons it was impossible before any of the reasons it was not. So he said nothing. He went home and ate supper and did not sleep poorly that night or any night after because of what he had decided. He slept fine. The decision was made. Now there was just the work. In May of 1975, Kellum Yarborough walked into the Exeter branch of First National Bank of Nebraska with $180 in cash, the money he had earned in 2 weeks baling hay for 3 farms in the district. He was 15 years old. Conrad Yarborough drove him to the bank and co-signed the account as required, then went out to wait in the truck. He did not ask many questions. The bank employee who opened the account was a woman in her 40s named Flossie Overby, who had a practiced warmth that came from opening hundreds of accounts for teenagers over the years, and who had developed a small routine for it, explain the interest rate, explain the withdrawal process, ask the young person what they were saving toward. College, she usually heard, a car, a trip somewhere. "What would you like to name this account?" she asked Kellum. Some young people like to give it a goal name. It helps with motivation. "Just savings," Kellum said. "It doesn't need a name." Flossie Overby typed it in and printed the receipt. She would retire from that bank 13 years later without any particular memory of this transaction. She had no way of knowing that the account she had just opened would receive deposits every few weeks for the next 8 years and close out at $194,000. 2 weeks after opening the account, Kellum was walking back to his bicycle after a shift at the grain elevator when Dewey Ketterman fell into step beside him. Dewey was the same age, the son of the man who ran the hardware store in Exeter, confident and easy in the way of people who have not yet run into anything they could not talk their way through. He was not a bad person. He was the kind of person who assumed that how the world looked from where he was standing was roughly how the world was. "I heard you're working every weekend now," Dewey said. "Most weekends. And you're banking it." "Yeah." Dewey looked at him sideways. "What for?" "Can't say yet." "Can't say or won't say?" Kellum considered this. "Both." Dewey made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Kellum, you are the strangest person I know. You're 15-year-old and you've got money in the bank and you won't tell anyone why." "That's right." Kellum did not answer. He got on his bicycle and rode home. He would not explain it to anyone. He would do it. What it looked like from the inside was different. In the summer of 1976, on a Saturday in July that reached 94 degrees by noon, Kellum was stacking the last of a hayload onto the bed of a flatbed for a farmer named Vickers, who ran 300 acres 6 miles south of Exeter. The work had started at 6 in the morning. It was now past 4 in the afternoon. His shirt was dark with sweat, and the baling twine had left red lines across both palms, and the back of his neck had burned through to something beyond sunburn that would not stop hurting until the following Wednesday. He loaded the last bale, climbed down, accepted the cash that Vickers counted out from a folded envelope, and pocketed it without counting it himself, which was something he did because it communicated trust, and trust kept work coming back. That evening, he drove past the Honeycut farm on the way home. The east field was high and green in the late summer light, the wheat standing well because Dwayne had been careful about moisture management that spring when other farms in the county had planted too early and lost ground to a late cold snap. Kellum did not stop. He drove past, looked through the fence for 3 seconds the way a man checks a landmark to confirm he is still on the right road, and drove on. He deposited $47 at First National the following Monday morning. The teller noted it without comment. The balance increased by $47. Nothing else changed that day. Over the next 3 years, Kellum Yarborough did the most consequential and least visible thing a person can do. He showed up. He baled hay in the summers for 3 different farms. He added weekend shifts at the grain elevator when he was 16. He was driving a combine for the 2 largest operations in the district by harvest season when he was 17, hired back each year, because he returned equipment in the condition he received it and understood that borrowed machinery returned in poor shape was a relationship ended, and he needed relationships to stay intact. He spent almost none of what he earned. This is the detail that people who heard the story later found most difficult to accept, because he was a teenager in rural Nebraska in the late 1970s, which meant there were things to spend money on if you wanted to spend it, and most people his age wanted to. Kellum genuinely did not want them, not as an act of discipline, not as a sacrifice. The land he was working toward was specific and real in his mind, and everything else was just delay. When you want something that clearly the years of preparation stop feeling like deprivation and start feeling like the most natural thing in the world, the obvious path, the one you take because the alternative is unthinkable. In the summer of 1976, when he was 16, Dewey Ketterman pulled up alongside him in his older brother's Chevy pickup on a Friday evening and offered a trip to Fairbury for burgers and a movie. Kellum had worked 12 hours that day. "You've got money," Dewey said. "Spend some of it. You earned it." "I'm saving it." "For what?" Same answer as before. Dewey shook his head with the specific frustration of someone who has been given the same non-answer twice and cannot understand why it keeps being given. "Kellum, I'm starting to think you're either the most disciplined person alive or you have no idea what to do with yourself." Kellum looked at his friend. He did not feel superior. He felt only the clean simplicity of a person who knows exactly what he is doing. And why looking at a person who cannot see it? "Probably both," Kellum said. Dewey drove off into the dark. Kellum watched the headlights disappear and felt nothing except the quiet awareness of how much longer the path was and how little that bothered him. Something happened the following autumn that Kellum had not planned for, and that changed the way he understood his own project. In October of 1977, Eldon Tolbert, the owner of the largest operation in the district and the man who employed Kellum to drive his combine each harvest, sat with him in the cab of the machine at the end of the last day of harvest, drinking coffee from a thermos, watching the dark come down over a field they had finished. Eldon was 60 years old and had been farming Fillmore County his entire life. He was not a man who asked personal questions, which was why the one he asked landed with more weight than it might have otherwise. People say you don't spend any of what you make, Eldon said. It was not quite a question. I save it? What for? Kellum looked out at the field. He had decided years ago not to answer this question. But something about the end of a long harvest day, in the dark coming down, and the fact that Eldon Tolbert had trusted him with expensive machinery and good wages and not once asked what he did with the money until right now, made him answer differently than he usually did. Land, he said. Eldon Tolbert turned and looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, once the way experienced men nod when they hear an answer that requires no elaboration because it is complete. Whose land? Eldon asked. Kellum did not answer. Eldon nodded again, this time at the silence. All right, he said. He poured the last of his coffee onto the ground and screwed the cap back onto the thermos. I'll see you at planting. They never discussed it again. But the following spring, when Kellum showed up for the planting season, Eldon Tolbert gave him a small raise without being asked and without explaining why. In October of 1978, Kellum was 17 and working an evening shift at the grain elevator when Dwayne Honeyut came in with the last wheat delivery of the season. Dwayne Honeyut was 68 years old by then, still solid through the shoulders, still wearing the rubber boots and the faded canvas hat of a man who did not buy new equipment until the old equipment stopped functioning. He had spoken to Kellum perhaps 4 or 5 times over the years, the brief practical exchanges of people who lived close enough to know each other's names but not much more. While the elevator machinery processed the grain, there was a wait. Kellum used it. Mr. Honeyut, he said, the tile drainage you put in that was 1963. Dwayne looked at him with mild surprise, not suspicion. 63? How do you know about that? My father mentioned it. He said it was a sound decision. Most people thought different at the time. Until 1968. Dwayne Honeyut looked at Kellum for a beat longer than the exchange had strictly required. Then something shifted in his expression. Something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of attention. Until 68, he agreed. After that, nobody said anything. They just looked at my field and didn't say anything. That was the beginning. What followed was 20 minutes that Dwayne Honeyut would have described, if asked, as a pleasant conversation at the grain elevator with a young man who asked good questions. He talked about the tile drainage and what it had cost and why he had done it before the problem was obvious. He talked about the windbreaks he had planted on the northwest corners of 3 fields in 1969 when everyone said the ground was too valuable to give up to trees. He talked about the soil records he had kept since 1948, the graph paper folders in the gray filing cabinet, the way a piece of ground could be understood over time if you asked it the right questions consistently enough. The Crete silt loam that ran through the western sections of Fillmore County was unusual ground, Dwayne explained. Deep dark with an organic carbon content that reflected generations of careful management. Most soils degraded under continuous cropping if you let them. This soil could improve if you managed it right. He had spent 40 years trying to manage it right, and the records in the cabinet told the story of whether he had succeeded season by season in the only language that mattered, numbers on graph paper that did not lie. Kellum listened to all of it without taking notes. He asked 2 follow-up questions. He thanked Dwayne for his time when the grain had been processed and Dwayne was ready to leave. He drove home that evening and sat at his kitchen table and wrote down everything Dwayne had said word by word in the blue notebook he had bought for this purpose and had been carrying for a year. It took him 40 minutes to write it all down. Not because there was so much to record, but because he was careful about the precision of the language. Copying Dwayne's exact phrasing, where he could remember it, noting where he was paraphrasing, and marking in the margin, The 2 or 3 points where Dwayne had said something that seemed to carry more weight than the words on their own conveyed. One of those marginal notes read, "He said the records told him what the land was doing, not what he was doing to it, what it was doing. He meant the land had its own logic that the records revealed if you kept them long enough." Kellum sat with that sentence for a while before he went to bed. He was 17 years old, working 5 days a week on farms that did not belong to him, saving money for a piece of ground he had not yet touched. And here was the man who owned that ground telling him without knowing who he was talking to that the ground had a kind of intelligence that a careful person could learn to read. He did not know exactly what to do with that yet. He copied it down and closed the notebook and went to sleep. Some things take years to fully understand, and the understanding comes not through thinking, but through doing, and the doing was still years away. What he knew that night was simpler and sufficient. He had been asking the right questions. Dwayne Honeyut had answered them. And somewhere in the gray filing cabinet 4 miles west, the land itself had been keeping its own record the whole time. He would return to that notebook many times in the years ahead. He would add to it after each subsequent conversation with Dwayne. Each entry was brief and specific, a date, a topic, the exact phrasing Dwayne had used when he said something that mattered, and occasionally a question in the margin that Kellum intended to ask the next time they spoke. Over 4 years, the notebook accumulated enough that it became what it had always been intended to be, a record of one man's understanding of a piece of ground translated into the mind of another man who was learning it from the outside in. When Kellum finally opened that gray filing cabinet in the spring of 1983 and saw Dwayne's 40 years of graph paper folders, the cabinet and the notebook together formed something complete. One was the official record. The other was the education that made the official record legible. And the night Dwayne Honeyut died, he would read it from the first page to the last without stopping and write 4 words at the bottom of the final page. W. Honeyut, October 1982. That was all he knew how to say. Dwayne Honeyut had suspected for 2 years before he said anything. He was not a man who spoke before he was certain, and certainty with Dwayne came slowly through repeated observation over time, the same way he assessed a field before making a decision about it. But by the spring of 1980, after 3 conversations at the grain elevator and 1 visit from Kellum the previous autumn, that Dwayne had not fully understood until afterward he had become certain enough. It was a Saturday in April. Kellum had stopped by to ask about a piece of equipment Dwayne had mentioned, selling a second-hand cultivator that would save him 3 hours of work on the Tolbert operation each spring. They had looked at the equipment, discussed the price, and were walking back through the yard when Dwayne said it. "You ask about this land the way a man asks about land he's planning to do something with." Kellum did not break stride. He did not look away or look too deliberately at something else. He said nothing for 5 full seconds, which is a long time in a quiet farmyard, and then he said, "It's good land." Dwayne looked at him from the side. "It is," he said. They reached the gate. Dwayne held it open. Kellum walked through, and Dwayne Honeyut, who had spent 40 years learning when a conversation needed to be continued and when it needed to be left exactly where it was, let it rest there. But something had changed. Kellum felt it on the drive home and could not have explained it to anyone. Dwayne Honeyut had not asked him to leave. He had not told him the land was spoken for, or that there was a plan, or that someone in Omaha was already interested. He had simply named what he saw and waited to see what Kellum would do with it. And Kellum had not denied it. What had been a private project for 6 years had just been acknowledged silently and without commitment by the only other person in the world who mattered to it. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Kellum drove 4 miles east on the county road and lay awake that night for a while, not with anxiety, but with the particular alertness of someone who understands that the thing they have been working toward just became slightly more real. He was 19 years old. His account held $87,000. He had 5 years left, give or take, and he intended to use all of them. The years between 19 and 21 were the years that built the man who walked into Cletus Dunbar's office in February of 1983. Not the dramatic years, the quiet ones, the ones that required him to keep doing what he had been doing without any sign that it was working, because the signs of that kind of work do not show themselves until the end. He drove combine for Eldon Tolbert every harvest. He worked the grain elevator on evenings and weekends when the season required it. He picked up equipment maintenance work from 3 farms in the district, small jobs that paid by the hour, and that he was good at because he had learned that a man who fixed things carefully and charged fairly would never run out of work. He deposited money every few weeks in amounts that seemed small individually and that accumulated in amounts that eventually did not seem small at all. In the winter of his 20th year, he sat at the kitchen table of his parents' house late one evening with a sheet of notebook paper and a pencil and worked through the numbers for the 4th time that year. His account held $147,000. The Honeycut farm had not come to market. Dwayne was still alive and farming more slowly than before, but still opening the gray cabinet each season to add another page. If the pattern held, Kellum needed 2 more years, maybe 3. He could be patient. He had been patient for 6 years. Then he heard something that disrupted the patience, not by breaking it, but by revealing that it had a cost he had not fully calculated. Eldon Tolbert mentioned it over coffee one evening in December of 1981. Casually, the way men pass along county information they assume the other person will find useful. A company out of Lincoln had been quietly reaching out to farming families in the region, older operations without clear succession plans, asking about intent to sell. Not pressuring, just asking, making sure the families knew there was a buyer if they wanted one. Kellum heard this and said nothing and finished his coffee and drove home. He sat at the kitchen table at midnight and he did something he had not done before. He sat with the possibility that it would not happen. Not because he had failed, because the world could move in a way that removed the opportunity entirely before he arrived at it, and no amount of work or patience or silence on his part would change that. If Yvonne Fessler and Jasper Honeycut were contacted by a company with ready money and a smooth representative before Dwayne died, before the estate went through probate and auction, there might be no public process at all. 480 acres with 40 years of Dwayne Honeycut's attention behind it would become a line item in a corporate portfolio that would manage it at a distance and never know what was in the filing cabinet. Kellum sat with that for a long time. He did not panic. He was not built for panic. But he felt something real that night, something that his 6 years of preparation had not previously required him to feel, the specific fear of a man who understands that he can do everything right and still lose, not because of his own failure, but because of factors beyond any individual's reach. He got up from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the December field behind his rented house was flat and white under a partial moon, the corn stubble breaking through the snow in rows that led to a dark tree line at the far edge. He stood there for a while, watching nothing in particular, the way people stand at windows when they are not looking at something but through something past the immediate world to some version of it that exists further ahead. He had been 20 years old for 3 months. He had $147,000 in a savings account and a blue notebook full of conversations with a man he was not sure he was going to be able to reach in time. He had a mall and a rented room and a truck that needed its front brakes done before spring. He had no debt and no partner, and no one in the world who knew exactly what he was trying to do. He stood at the window for a long time, and then he did something that he had not done since the night of his decision in August of 1974. He went through the whole thing again from the beginning, not to reassure himself, to check whether he still believed it. Did he still want the Honeycut farm specifically? Yes. Did he still believe it was worth 8 years of the kind of work he had been doing? Yes. Did he still believe he could get there before the opportunity closed? He stood with this one longer. The moon moved behind a cloud and the field went darker. A wind came through and the corn stubble rattled against itself in the silence. Yes, he still believed it, not because he had proof, because he had built his understanding of the land and the man who owned it across 5 years of careful attention, and what he understood told him that Dwayne Honeycut was not going to sell quietly to a company from Lincoln. That was not the kind of man Dwayne was. Kellum knew this not from a single piece of evidence, but from the accumulated weight of everything Dwayne had said and not said across 5 years of conversations, and that accumulated weight was as reliable as any legal document. He went back to the table. He folded the notebook paper and put it in the drawer. It was past 1 in the morning when he put the pencil down. He thought about the conversation at the farm gate in 1980. He thought about what Dwayne had said and what he had not said and what he had done by saying it. He thought about the 20 minutes at the grain elevator in 1978 and the way Dwayne had talked about the soil records and the windbreaks, the way a man talks about things he wants to make sure someone else understands before it is too late to explain them. Dwayne Honeycut had not been making conversation. He had been making a record of a different kind. Kellum folded the notebook paper, put it in the kitchen drawer, and went to bed. He had decided what he needed to do in the morning. He drove out on a Sunday morning in January of 1982, not along the county road past the east fence, but up the gravel driveway to the front of the house the way a person visits who has a reason to be there. He knocked on the door of the farmhouse that Dwayne Honeycut had maintained the way he maintained everything, with steady attention to the things that mattered and no attention at all to the things that did not. Dwayne opened the door, looked at Kellum Yarborough for one beat and said, "Come in." They sat at the kitchen table. Evelyn had been gone 3 years, and the kitchen had the particular quality of a room where a woman had once been and was no longer not neglected, but quieter, organized differently in the way that men organize spaces when they are the only ones using them. Dwayne made coffee. They talked about the winter, about the forecast for spring, about a section of tile drainage on the east boundary that Dwayne said he wanted to check before thaw because something in the outflow pattern last autumn had seemed slightly off to him, a small discrepancy that probably meant nothing, but that he preferred to verify rather than assume. They did not talk about the company from Lincoln. They did not talk about Yvonne or Jasper. They did not talk about what would happen to the farm when Dwayne was no longer there to ask questions about the outflow pattern. But when Kellum stood it up to leave, Dwayne said, "Come back in the spring. I want to show you something in the north section." Kellum said he would. He drove home knowing something he had not known when he drove out, though he could not have testified to it in any court. Dwayne Honeycut was not going to sell privately to a company from Lincoln. Not because Dwayne had said so, but because a man who invites you back in the spring to show you something in the north section is not a man who expects a company from Lincoln to be the next conversation that matters. He deposited his next paycheck the following Friday and did not think about the company from Lincoln again. Dwayne Honeycut died in October of 1982. He had been admitted to Fairbury Hospital in September with a heart that was working too hard to do what hearts are designed to do. And after 7 weeks of treatment that slowed the process without reversing it, he died on a Tuesday morning with the prairie outside the window flat, brown and moving slowly in an early autumn wind. He was 72 years old. He had farmed 480 acres for most of his adult life. He had kept 40 years of records in a gray filing cabinet. He had planted trees that people said were a waste of good ground, and the trees had protected his topsoil for 13 years. He had installed drainage that people said was an unnecessary expense, and the drainage had saved his east field twice in 2 wet seasons. He had done these things without asking for recognition and without receiving much, because the recognition that mattered to Dwayne Honeycutt came from the land itself, from yield numbers that confirmed his decisions year after year, from soil that stayed where he put it while his neighbors lost theirs in the wind. He left everything to his two surviving siblings. Kellum heard the news from Eldon Tolbert, who called before the notice appeared in the paper. He stood at the counter after the call ended and looked at the wall for a while. He had known Dwayne Honeycutt slightly, 9 conversations, perhaps 10, an hour total if you added up the minutes. Not a friendship, not even an acquaintance in the full sense of the word. But something had passed between them in those hours that Kellum understood had no category in ordinary social language. Dwayne Honeycutt had built something over 40 years and had spent the last 4 of those years making sure one person understood what he had built and why. He had not said this outright. He had simply done it. Kellum took the blue notebook from the shelf above his desk and read it from the first page to the last. Every conversation, every detail he had written down after every exchange. At the bottom of the final page, he wrote D. Honeycutt, October 1982, 72 years old, 480 acres, 40 years. He closed the notebook, put it back on the shelf, made supper and ate it, and went to bed at his usual time because the work he had been doing for 8 years was not finished yet. The sale notice appeared in the Exeter Courier on a Tuesday morning in December of 1982. Kellum read it standing beside his mailbox in the cold, his breath showing in the air above the page. Estate of Dwayne and Evelyn Honeycutt, 480 acres, Fillmore County. Sealed bid process. Bids accepted through February 4th, 1983. Opening February 7th. Interested parties to contact Cletus Dunbar, attorney, Fairbury. He read it twice, folded the paper, put it in his jacket pocket, got in his truck and drove to work. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table and worked through the numbers one final time. Account balance $185,000 with 2 more paychecks before the February deadline that would bring it to $194,000. Corporate buyers with portfolio logic would calculate ROI over 15 years and arrive at a number in the high 260s or low 270s. Private investors might stretch to the low 280s. Individual buyers with local knowledge would cluster in the 250s. Kellum did not calculate his number by trying to beat the others. He calculated it by asking himself carefully and honestly what this specific land was worth to him, to a man who intended to farm it for the rest of his life, who knew its drainage and its windbreaks and its soil history, who had the operating capital to run it without borrowing, and who had been preparing for this single transaction for 8 years. He wrote down $286,000. He sat with it, looked at it, added and subtracted from different angles. It held. He had $92,000 left after the purchase, which was 2 full years of operating capital without any revenue from the land. And he had calculated that he needed exactly 2 years to get the farm running at the level where it would sustain itself. He had made this calculation 4 times over 4 years. It came out the same every time. He drove to Fairbury on a Wednesday morning to meet Cletus Dunbar. Dunbar was 58 years old and had been handling estate sales in this part of Nebraska for 26 years. He was a compact man with the measured manner of someone who had learned to take the long view of human nature which in his profession meant learning not to be surprised by either the generosity or the pettiness that estates brought out in families, and also learning not to make assumptions about who in a room had money and who did not. Even so, when Kellum Yarbrough sat down across from him in the good clothes that were clearly his best and not his everyday, Dunbar made the assessment that everyone made, which was that this was a young man, 22 at most, without the kind of institutional backing that the Honeycutt property would require. He explained the process. Sealed bids, documentation of financing required at submission, expected price range based on comparable sales 260 to 310. How are you planning to finance the purchase? Dunbar asked. Cash, Kellum said. Dunbar paused in the way of a man who does not want to show that he is pausing. You'll need to document available funds. Kellum reached into the folder he had carried in from his truck and laid 8 years of bank statements on the desk. They were in order, oldest to most recent, held together with a single paperclip. Dunbar looked at them. He read for 45 seconds without speaking, which is a long time in a professional meeting. You started this account when you were 15. Yes, my father co-signed. All of this is employment income. Yes, hay baling, grain elevator work, combined operation equipment maintenance, 8 years. Dunbar set the statements down. He was a man who had learned to read the distance between what people said and what they meant, and what he was reading in Kellum Yarbrough was a complete absence of that distance. The statements were exactly what they appeared to be. The young man across from him was exactly what he said he was. Why this farm specifically? Dunbar asked. Kellum thought about the county road, the bicycle, the August afternoon 8 years ago. He thought about the 3 minutes he had stood at the fence. He thought about 10 conversations with the man who was now dead and a blue notebook he had carried for 4 years. I've been watching it for 8 years, he said. I know what it is. Dunbar accepted the documentation. He would think about that answer for weeks afterward. While Kellum was sitting in Dunbar's office, Norbert Penley was sitting in his office in Lincoln with a spreadsheet open and the Honeycutt property near the top of his acquisition list for the quarter. Penley was 44 years old and had a master's degree in agricultural economics from the University of Nebraska and 18 years of experience buying farmland across 3 states for Meridian Agrarian Partners. He was methodical and disciplined, and he trusted his models, which had earned that trust over a long period. His model valued the Honeycutt property at $268,000. His standard acquisition strategy was to bid 8 to 10% above model value. That put his number at $283,000. He did not know that anyone named Kellum Yarbrough existed. 1 week before the bid deadline, Penley called Cletus Dunbar. Mr. Dunbar, he said, I want to be straightforward with you. Is this a competitive field, or are we looking at a few local buyers who are hoping for a favorable outcome? I can't discuss other bidders, Dunbar said. I'm not asking about names. I'm asking about the nature of the competition, whether it makes sense to be conservative or whether I should bring my real number. A brief silence. Not long enough to be meaningful on its own, but Penley had made many of these calls, and he heard what was in it. Mr. Penley, Dunbar said, I'll tell you what I tell every serious bidder. Submit the number that reflects what the property is genuinely worth to you, not what you think will win, what it's worth. Penley thanked him and ended the call. He looked at his spreadsheet, $283,000. He submitted that number because his model was his model and he trusted it, and because he had submitted bids on 12 properties in the past 3 years and had won 11 of them. He was going to win this one too. On the evening of February 3rd, the night before Kellum was due to drive the sealed envelope to Dunbar's office, he came home from a late shift at the grain elevator and found Conrad Yarbrough's truck in front of the house. His father was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, which meant he had been there long enough to find the percolator and make a pot. Kellum hung up his jacket, sat down across from his father. The sealed envelope was on the table between them. He had not planned to have this conversation tonight or possibly ever. He had planned to submit the bid in the morning and tell his father when it was done, when there was a fact to report rather than an intention to explain. Conrad looked at the envelope. Bid for what? The Honeycut farm. The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator ran. Outside, the wind had picked up from the northwest and was pushing against the window over the sink. Kellum, Conrad said. I know what you're going to say. That land will go for close to $300,000. I'm bidding 286. Conrad looked at his son. Something moved across his face that was not one emotion but several arriving in sequence too fast to separate. You have 286. I have 194 in the account. I bid 286. I keep 92 back for 2 years of operating capital. No debt. Conrad set his coffee down. He looked at the table. He had co-signed that bank account in 1975 as a formality, a legal requirement for a 15-year-old, and he had watched the balance grow in the statements that occasionally arrived at the house over the years, and he had made a remark once at supper about his son being either very disciplined or very boring for a teenager, and he had laughed when Kellum said probably both. He had not connected the growth of that account to any specific destination. The future had apparently defined itself 9 years before on a county road in August, and Conrad Yarro was only finding out now. When did you decide this, he said. I was 14, August of '74. I was riding home past the east fence line, and I stopped and looked at the field, and I decided. You never said anything. No, 9 years, Conrad said. 8, really. I started working toward it when I was 15. Conrad looked at the envelope again. The kitchen was still quiet. The wind pushed against the window. Why didn't you tell me? Kellum answered without hesitation because he had thought about this question for a long time. Because you would have told me I was crazy, and you would have been right by every normal measure, and I would have had to spend energy either convincing you or resisting what you thought, and I needed that energy for the work. Conrad was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator cycled off and the kitchen got quieter. I would have said that, Conrad said. I would have said you were crazy. I know, and I would have been wrong. Those 5 words came out differently from the others, slower and with more weight in the way of a man who is saying something he has arrived at honestly and is not going to soften or revise. Conrad Yarro had been careful and correct in his decisions his entire working life. He had said no to Quimby quarrels in 1973 because the numbers did not support yes, and he had been right. He had made sound call after sound call on a small operation with thin margins. And the result of all those sound calls was that he was sitting at a kitchen table in his early 50s with a small farm and no debt and no savings either. His son had made one decision at 14 years old and held it for 8 years in silence. And the result was sitting in a sealed envelope on the table between them. Do you need anything from me? Conrad asked. No, I just wanted you to know. Conrad nodded once. He pushed back from the table and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. At the door, he stopped. You're sending it tomorrow morning. First thing. All right, Conrad said. He went out into the February cold. His truck started and the headlights swept across the kitchen window. And then he was gone. Kellum sat at the table for a while after. He was simply present with the fact that the thing he had built alone for 8 years had just been seen by his father, and that his father had said without being asked, and without any particular warmth or celebration, the exact right thing. In the morning, he drove to Fairbury and handed the envelope to Dunbar's receptionist before the office officially opened. Then he drove back to Exeter and went to work. He did not tell his mother that day or the next. He would tell her when there was something to tell. 4 days later, on the morning of February 7th, Cletus Dunbar sat in his conference room with Yvonne Fessler, Jasper Honeycutt, and a notary named Patricia Voss who had been doing this work for Dunbar for 11 years. The sealed envelopes were arranged on the table in the order Dunbar planned to open them, which was ascending by the bid amount he estimated each to contain based on the documentation submitted. He opened the first envelope, a retired farmer from Crete, $244,000. Yvonne Fessler, who had flown in from Omaha and was wearing the careful outfit of a woman who wanted to appear appropriate for a legal proceeding without appearing greedy about the outcome, wrote the number on the notepad in front of her. Second envelope, a private buyer from Hastings, $258,000. Jasper Honeycutt, who had driven from Grand Island and who looked tired in the way of men who have recently completed difficult paperwork about a brother they are now selling the property of, nodded slightly. Third envelope, Meridian Agrarian Partners Lincoln, $283,000. Jasper sat up slightly. He knew the name. Fourth envelope, a land investment partnership from Omaha, $271,000, below the third. Dunbar looked at the fifth envelope. He picked it up. He had wondered since the morning 3 weeks earlier when a 22-year-old had laid 8 years of bank statements on his desk, whether the number inside would be what the young man had said it would be. He opened it. Kellum, Yarro, $286,000. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where an unexpected thing has just been said. Yvonne Fessler looked up from her notepad. Who is Kellum Yarro? Dunbar set the envelope down. He thought about the 45 seconds he had spent reading those bank statements. He thought about the young man in the flannel shirt who had answered the question about why this farm with 7 words. A young man from Exeter, he said, 22 years old. He's been saving for this since he was 14. 8 years of farm labor, no other income source. He has the full amount in cash and sufficient operating capital to run the property without financing for 2 years. The room was quiet again. Jasper Honeycutt looked at the notepad where Yvonne had written the numbers in a column. Then he looked out the window at the February sky gray and flat and low over Fairbury. He thought about his brother Dwayne, who had installed drainage tile when everyone said it was a waste, who had planted trees when everyone said the ground was too valuable, who had kept records in a gray cabinet for 40 years because he believed the land deserved to be known that carefully. Jasper Honeycutt was 64 years old and had spent his career as an accountant in Grand Island and had not farmed a single acre in his life. And he understood, sitting in that conference room, exactly what kind of man had just won the bid on his brother's farm. Dwayne would have liked that, he said. Dunbar heard it and did not respond immediately because some things deserve a moment before they get a response. Then he said yes, he would have. Cletus Dunbar drove out to the Yarborough farm on a Thursday afternoon in July of 1983, and he drove out alone without a professional reason, which was something he had not done in 26 years of practice. He had handled 140 estate sales. He had managed transfers of property worth tens of millions of dollars in aggregate. He had sat across from grieving families and calculating heirs and institutional buyers with cold spreadsheets, and he had done his job well each time, which meant he had done it without attachment to the outcome. The outcome was not his business. His business was the process. But he had been thinking about Kellum Yarborough since February, and when the wheat in the East Field came in strong through June, and the windbreaks held their line against the summer winds off the plains, he found himself wanting to see the farm, not as the property he had administered, but as the thing it had actually become. So he called ahead and drove out on a Thursday, and Kellum met him at the gate. They walked the East Field together in the afternoon heat. The winter wheat had already been harvested, and the ground was turned and resting dark and clean, the appearance of ground that was being managed rather than used. The windbreaks Dwayne had planted stood on the northwest corners exactly as Dwayne had designed them, doing the slow, invisible work of protecting topsoil that no one would notice until the year they were gone. Dunbar had been composing something in his mind for 5 months, and he said it now while they walked because it was easier to say things like this while moving than while sitting still. Norbert Pendley called me, he said, the week after the results were posted. Kellum looked at the ground ahead of them. What did he want? He wanted to know who submitted the winning bid. I told him. He wanted to know how you financed it. I told him. Then he asked how old you were, and I told him that too, and there was a pause on the line that I don't think he expected. What did he say? He said he'd been in the business for 20 years and had never waited 80 years for anything. Dunbar paused. I told him that might be the difference. Kellum was quiet for a moment. Around them, the turned earth held the particular silence of summer fields between seasons, the silence of ground that is gathering itself. Did he understand what you meant? I think he heard it. Whether he understood it is different. They walked a while longer without speaking. A red-tailed hawk worked a thermal above the south section patient and systematic in its circles, and Kellum watched it for a moment before looking back at the ground. He built a good model, Kellum said. For what he was trying to do, 283 was probably exactly right. Dunbar looked at him. You're not angry at them. He didn't do anything wrong. He just wasn't building what I was building. Dunbar thought about that for the rest of the walk and most of the drive back to Fairbury, and intermittently for the next 20 years. What he knew by the time he reached the highway back to town was that in 26 years and 140 estate sales, he had never seen a buyer who knew the property better than the estate that was selling it. Kellum Yarborough had known Dwayne Honeycut's farm better than Yvonne Fessler, and Jasper Honeycutt had known it, and they had grown up 40 miles away with a brother who farmed it for 40 years. That kind of knowledge did not come from proximity. It came from the specific attention of someone who had decided at 14 years old that the land was worth understanding completely before he ever owned a single acre of it. Dunbar would say this at his retirement dinner 20 years later, when someone asked him about the most memorable transaction of his career. He would not call it the most profitable or the most complex. He would call it the one that clarified something for him about the difference between people who acquire things and people who earn the right to them. Norbert Pendley spent the week after that call sitting with a discomfort he did not usually allow himself. He was a methodical man, and methodical men are not accustomed to losses that their models cannot explain. He could not find the error. He had bid correctly according to his methodology. He had bid above model value. He had probed the competitive field and raised his number accordingly. He had done everything right, and he had still lost to a 22-year-old from Exeter, Nebraska, who had been saving money since he was 15 years old, and who had decided he wanted that specific piece of ground before he was old enough to legally sign a contract. What bothered Pendley was the architecture of the other man's advantage. Kellum Yarborough had not won because he had more money. Meridian Agrarian Partners had more money. He had won because he had spent 8 years accumulating a kind of knowledge about one specific piece of ground that could not be replicated quickly or purchased from any source, and because that knowledge had allowed him to value the property not according to what the market said it was worth, but according to what it was worth to him, specifically for the purpose he specifically intended. Pendley's model could not generate that number. It was a good model for competing across portfolios and time horizons. It was the wrong instrument for competing against a man who had been preparing for one transaction for 8 years with no intention of ever competing at all. He made a note in his file, not an official notation, not something that would appear in any quarterly report, a personal note written in the margin of the Honeycutt property folder in a way that he would see every time he opened it for the next 3 years before the folder was finally archived. It said only Yarborough. 8 years. Think about this. He did think about it. Not enough to change his methodology because his methodology worked 11 times out of 12, and that was an excellent rate. But enough to understand that there existed a category of buyer that his models would never identify in advance, because the data points that define that category, the specific knowledge accumulated over years, the willingness to wait for one particular thing rather than the most available thing, the clarity of purpose that made the valuation personal rather than comparative, none of those things appeared in comparable sales or soil ratings or commodity price projections. He thought about Kellum Yarborough occasionally for years afterward, not with resentment, with the professional respect of a man who encountered a competitor operating from a completely different set of principles and understood without being able to replicate it that those principles had produced something his own could not. On a morning in early April of 1983, 3 days after he moved in, Kellum walked the full perimeter of the 480 acres alone. He started at the farmhouse at first light and walked the fence lines in order east, first, then north, then west, then south, covering the boundary of the property. The way a man walks through a house he has just bought not to inspect it, but to feel it under his feet, to make the abstract fact of ownership into something physical and real. It took 4 hours. The ground was soft from a late snow the week before, and the soil compressed slightly underfoot in the low sections and stayed firm on the rises exactly as Dwayne's drainage records had described it. The windbreaks on the northwest corners were 10 feet taller than they had been in 1969 when Dwayne planted them, and they moved in the April wind with the established solidity of trees that had been in one place long enough to stop being trees and start being part of the landscape. Kellum walked all of it without stopping. He did not take notes. He did not carry the blue notebook. He was simply present in the ground, letting his feet read what the records had described, confirming with his body what his mind had learned over 8 years of careful listening. When he came back to the farmhouse, he went directly to the small office, opened the gray filing cabinet to the top drawer, and added a single line to the first entry he had made the previous week. Walk the full perimeter. Ground matches the records. Everything is here. Then he went out to start the day's work. In September of 1983, on a Sunday afternoon, Dewey Ketterman drove out to the farm. He had heard the story by then the way everyone in Fillmore County had heard it, in pieces and through various sources, each piece slightly more improbable than the last, until the accumulated picture became something that people in the county discuss. The way they discussed unusual weather or exceptional harvests as a fact that was verifiable but still somehow difficult to hold in the mind. Dewey parked in the yard and got out of his truck and stood looking at the farm for a while before Kellum came out of the barn. They had not spoken since the previous winter before any of this had happened. Dewey had not congratulated him when the news got around, not because he did not want to, but because he was not sure what to say, and had learned over the years that saying nothing was sometimes better than saying something that did not fit. He still was not entirely sure what to say, but he had driven out here anyway, which was its own kind of statement. "You actually did it," Dewey said. "Yeah." Dewey looked at the farmhouse, at the windbreaks on the northwest corners, at the turned earth of the east field visible past the barn. He had grown up in the same county as this land. He had driven past it hundreds of times. He had never looked at it the way Kellum was looking at it now, which was the way a person looks at something that belongs to them, not just legally, but in some deeper accounting that the law does not cover. "I told you that you couldn't have 280,000, Dewey said. "Last winter at your place. I told you no one could save that much from farm work." "I know. I was wrong." "You were," Kellum said, not unkindly, just accurately. Dewey was quiet for a moment. He had been working through what to say on the drive out, and now that he was here, it felt both necessary and insufficient, which was usually how honest things felt. Why didn't you ever tell me, not just last winter, back when we were kids, when you first started saving? Kellum leaned against the fence post at the edge of the yard, because the conversation we would have had about it would have been the wrong conversation, he said. You would have measured it against what seemed possible, and by that measure it wasn't possible. And you would have been right by that measure, but the measure was wrong for what I was doing. Dewey looked at him. What was the right measure? Whether it was worth the time it was going to take. Dewey let that sit. He was 22 years old in this moment, running the hardware store that his father had built, and he was not unhappy. He was also not a man who had ever decided something at 14 and held it for 8 years and arrived at the destination with the specific gravity that was visible in Kellum Yarborough right now. I spent that Friday night money on a burger and a movie, Dewey said. The night you said no, I can't remember which movie. Probably didn't matter? No. Dewey looked at the ground for a moment. No, I guess it didn't. He looked up. You don't hold it against me, any of it. There's nothing to hold, Kellum said. You didn't know what I was doing. I didn't tell you. You could have. I could have. And you would have tried to talk me out of it because that's what a friend does when they think you're making a mistake. And from where you were standing, it looked like a mistake. Dewey nodded slowly. He was working through something, and Kellum let him work through it because that was what the moment required. I think, Dewey said finally, that I didn't know you as well as I thought I did. Most people didn't, for 22 years. Yeah, Dewey laughed a short and honest laugh, the kind that acknowledges something absurd rather than celebrating anything. That's either impressive or strange. I haven't decided which. Probably both, Kellum said. Dewey drove home that afternoon with the windows down. The September air, warm and dry, and carrying the smell of turned earth and cut wheat that was the smell of Fillmore County in the fall. He thought about the conversation. He thought about the hardware store and the house he owned and the life he had built through proximity and inheritance and reasonable choices made in reasonable sequence. He did not feel sorry for himself, but he carried something home with him that he had not had when he drove out a small, permanent understanding that some people move through the world at a different depth than others, and that the surface of a person is almost never the whole of them, and that the ones who seem most ordinary from the outside are sometimes the ones who are doing the most invisible work. He never forgot the conversation. He told it to his son 15 years later when his son was 17 and talking about wanting things and not knowing how to get them. And he told it not as a lesson exactly, but as an example of the kind of thinking that he had been close to for 22 years without recognizing it. Conrad Yarborough visited the farm for the first time on the afternoon of April 1st, 1983, the day Kellum moved in. He had not been invited specifically, but he came because some things do not require an invitation. He stood in the yard for a long time. He looked at the windbreaks in the farmhouse and the barn and the flat, dark earth of the fields running to the fence lines in every direction. He did not say anything for several minutes, which was unusual for Conrad, who was not a silent man by nature. Then he said, I want to see the filing cabinet. Kellum took him into the small office off the kitchen. The gray cabinet stood in the corner where it had always stood. Kellum opened the top drawer and stepped back. Conrad looked at the folders without touching them. He read the labels. Eastfield wheat yield, followed by a year. North section soil test results, followed by a year. Windbreak condition, followed by a year. 40 years of Dwayne Honeyut's attention to a piece of ground organized and labeled in waiting. He kept this since when, Conrad said. 1948. Conrad closed the drawer. He opened the one below it. Same organization, same handwriting. except for one folder near the back labeled in a different hand Eastfield Wheat Yield, 1983. Kellum's first entry made before the move-in was complete because the record needed to begin where Dwayne's had ended. Conrad looked at the folder without pulling it out. Then he closed the drawer and stood in the small office for a moment. I drove past this farm for 30 years, he said. Never thought much about it except that Dwayne kept it well. He did. I didn't think about what it meant that he kept it well. The difference between a farm that's managed and a farm that's cared about. I understood the practical side. I didn't understand the other part. Kellum leaned against the doorframe. What other part? Conrad looked at the cabinet. That you can spend 40 years talking to a piece of ground, and it'll talk back. Through the records, through the yield, through the soil. He paused. I spent 30 years on my place making good decisions. I don't have 40 years of records. I don't know my ground the way Dwayne knew this ground, the way you're going to know it. This was more than Conrad Yarborough usually said about anything that mattered to him, and both of them knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, which was the right way to handle it. You made the right calls, Kellum said, with what you had. I made the safe calls, Conrad said. There's a difference. I knew the difference at the time, and I made the safe ones anyway. He looked at his son. You made the right call when you were 14 years old, and you didn't tell anyone because you knew what the safe call would have told you to do. Kellum said nothing. Outside, a red-winged blackbird landed on the fence post and sat for a moment and flew. Conrad watched it go. He had been a farmer his entire adult life, and he had never thought of himself as a man who missed things. He paid attention. He read the weather and the soil and the market with the consistency of someone whose livelihood depended on accuracy. But standing in this small office, looking at a gray filing cabinet that his son had driven past for 8 years while quietly building toward it, Conrad understood something about attention that he had not understood before. There were two kinds of attention. There was the kind he practiced, which was responsive and competent and concerned with what was immediately in front of you. And there was the kind his son practiced, which reached ahead into the future and identified the thing that mattered most and organized everything else around moving toward it. The first kind kept you solvent. The second kind built something. He had spent 30 years perfecting the first kind and never known the second kind existed in his own household, walking out the door to work every Saturday morning before he was out of bed. I thought I knew my kids, Conrad said. Not to Kellum specifically, more to the room, to the filing cabinet, to the record of 40 years that was standing witness to the conversation. You knew me, Kellum said. You just didn't know what I was doing. Is there a difference? Kellum thought about this honestly. I think so. You knew what kind of person I was. That's the important part. You just didn't know the destination. Conrad nodded slowly. That was a fair distinction, and he was a fair man. He accepted it. I should have known, Conrad said. When I co-signed that account, I should have asked. It wouldn't have changed anything. No, Conrad agreed, but I would have known sooner. He looked at the cabinet one more time. That's worth something, knowing sooner. He drove home an hour later. He would come back every year for the next 24 years, sometimes with Thelma, sometimes alone, always in the spring when the planting was done, and the first green was coming up in the fields and the farm looked most like the thing it was trying to be. He never asked Kellum to explain it again. He understood it. He just kept being moved by it, the way people are moved by things that show them a version of courage they had not known was available. Thelma Yarborough had said the most important thing 2 weeks earlier, on the evening that Kellum came to tell his parents the bid had won. He had driven over after getting the call from Dunbar's office. Conrad was not home yet. Thelma was in the kitchen doing what she did in the kitchen on Thursday evenings, And Kellum sat at the table where he had sat for the first 15 years of his life, doing homework and eating meals and listening to conversations he was not supposed to hear. "I won the bid," he said, "on the Honeycut farm." Thelma put down what she was holding. She turned around and looked at her son. She did not ask how or how much or what comes next. She had known since 1978 when she had found a bank statement in his jacket pocket before washing it with a balance that told her everything she needed to know about where the money had been going and for how long. She had put the statement back. She had washed the jacket. She had not asked him about it then or ever. What she had done in the years since was watch. Watch him leave early and come home late. Watch him turn down the things that other 20-year-olds wanted. Watch him sit at the table with the notebook paper and the pencil and work through numbers that she could see on the page from across the room were too large to be about anything ordinary. "The Honeycut farm," she said. "Yes. How long have you been working toward it?" "Since I was 14. Thelma nodded once. She looked at her son for a long moment, the way she had looked at him when he was 8 years old and had fixed the kitchen faucet by himself without being asked, the look of a woman recognizing something in a child that she had hoped was there, but had not been certain of until now. "I knew it was something big," she said. "I didn't know it was that. I know. I couldn't say it out loud until it was done. I've been getting ready for 8 years. She walked over to where he was sitting and put her hand on his shoulder for exactly 3 seconds, which was how Thelma Yarborough expressed the things that other people spent paragraphs trying to say. Then she went back to the counter and finished what she had been doing. There is a particular kind of parent who understands that the deepest thing you can do for a child who has decided to pursue something difficult is to stay out of the way, not out of indifference, out of faith. Thelma Yarborough had practiced that kind of faith for 8 years without anyone asking her to, and without anyone thanking her for it, and she would practice it for many more years afterward, watching her son expand the operation and keep the records and care for the land in the way that she had seen back in 1978 was the destination of all that saving. She never told anyone about the bank statement. Not Conrad, not the neighbors, not her sister in Kearney, who had always thought Kellum was a strange and quiet boy. It was not her story to tell. It was his story to live, and the living of it required that it stay private until it was done. What she told people when they asked in the months after the news got around was simple, that she had known something large was happening, that she had chosen to trust it, and that trust turned out to be the only thing required of her. People found this answer either obvious or profound, depending on how much they had thought about what it costs a parent to stay out of the way when everything in them wants to intervene. By 1991, the farm was running exactly as Kellum had calculated it would. He bought the adjacent property that year when it came on the market, 160 acres of ground that shared a fence line with the north section and that had been farmed conservatively for 20 years by an older couple with no intention of continuing. He paid cash. He added the new acreage to the record system opening folders in the filing cabinet with the same labels Dwayne had used, asking the same questions of the new ground that Dwayne had asked of the original 480. 640 acres, then in 1997, 840. Then in 2003, a flat and productive 1,000. He never talked about the early years, except when asked directly, and even then he talked about them the way people talk about distances traveled, rather than achievements accomplished, as a description of ground covered rather than a claim about what the covering proved. He did not think of the 8 years as remarkable. He thought of them as necessary. Conrad died in the spring of 2007 on a Tuesday morning in late April at the hospital in Fairbury, where Dwayne Honeyut had died 25 years earlier. He was 73 years old, and he had spent the last decade of his life driving out to his son's farm in the spring and sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and looking out the window at the fields. He had watched the operation grow from 480 to 1,000 acres and had said nothing about it that was not simple and true, which was the only kind of thing Conrad Yarborough said about anything in his final years. That was Conrad Yarborough in full. The man who knew when he was wrong and said so plainly without theater, and then helped carry the envelope to the truck in the morning. He was, Kellum said. He knew what you did. He saw it. That mattered to him. I could tell the few times I saw him out at your place. He looked at that farm the way a man looks at something he's proud of that he can't exactly take credit for. Kellum thought about that. He took some of the credit. He co-signed the bank account. Dewey laughed the real laugh this time, the one that meant something, and Kellum laughed too. And it was the most they had laughed together since they were boys, which was appropriate for a funeral, because grief and humor are not opposites and never have been. Alfred Yarborough had grown up on the farm the way children grow up on farms that have been in a family long enough to feel like a fact of nature rather than a human decision. He had learned to drive a tractor before he learned to drive a car. He had helped with planting and harvest every year of his childhood. He had done his homework at the kitchen table, the same table, different homework, same window looking out at the same fields. And he had absorbed, without being taught, the rhythms of a farm run by a man who believed in records and patience, and the kind of improvement that does not show itself until you look back across a decade. He had started reading the filing cabinet at 18, not because anyone told him to, but because one winter afternoon with nothing particular to do, he had opened the top drawer out of curiosity and had not been able to stop. It was the accumulation that got him. Not any single entry, but the accumulation 40 years of Dwayne Honeyut's handwriting, followed by 30 years of his father's asking the same questions, of the same ground in the same format, the answers shifting year by year in ways that told the story of soil that was being attended to with consistency and care. He read it the way you read a long book that reveals something on the last page that reframes everything that came before, except the last page kept being added to every season. He started his own entries that year in his father's format with his own handwriting on the same graph paper that Dwayne Honeyut had ordered specially from a supplier in Lincoln, and that Kellum had continued ordering from the same company for 30 years. The first entry Alfred ever made on his own was in the spring of 2000 when he was 18 years old. He had been helping his father with the planting that week, and on the last day of work after his father had gone in for supper, Alfred had stayed in the field for a while longer, walking the south section in the late afternoon light, the way his father sometimes walked it, not inspecting, but attending. He came in after dark and went directly to the small office and wrote South Section, Spring Condition 2000. Soil temp 48 degrees Fahrenheit at 4 inches. Germination starting in the east rows. Same pattern as 1983 entry on page 7. Ground is consistent. He had cross-referenced with Dwayne's 1967 entry for the same section before he wrote it, checking whether the pattern went back further. It did. The south section had been germinating east first since Dwayne's earliest records. Alfred wrote that in the margin. 3 hands across 3 generations, and the ground itself was a continuous thread running through all of them. His father found the entry the following week and read it without comment, but he took out the 1967 folder and laid it next to Alfred's entry on the desk and looked at them side by side for a long moment before putting them both away. He did not say anything. He did not need to. On an evening in late autumn of 2014, Alfred was in the small office going through the folders for the current season when his father came in from the barn and stood in the doorway. "You know, he never told me what those conversations at the elevator were for," Alfred said without turning around. I've read everything in here, and I still can't find the moment when Honeycutt understood what you were doing. I'm not sure there was a single moment, Kellum said. I think he suspected and chose not to ask. Why wouldn't he ask? Kellum leaned against the doorframe. He was 53 years old, and the years of farm work had settled into his body in the way they settle into the bodies of men who have done it long enough, a specific solidity and economy of movement. Because if he asked and I said yes, it became a negotiation or an obligation or a promise. None of those were what he wanted. What did he want? For the land to go to whoever was right for it and to not be responsible for the choosing. Alford thought about that. He pulled out a folder from the middle of the cabinet, a folder from 1961 Dwayne's handwriting. He read the entry. Then he pulled out the corresponding folder from 1991, his father's entry for the same field in the same season. Side by side, the two pieces of paper described the same ground 30 years apart, in the same language, asking the same questions, finding some of the same answers. He would have liked knowing you kept the format, Alford said. I kept it because it was the right format. He'd worked out what to ask. No reason to invent something worse. Alford put both folders back. He closed the drawer. He stood in the small office that Dwayne Honeycutt had built and his father had inherited, and he now worked in every season, and he felt the weight of the place in a way that was not burden and not obligation, but something more like inheritance in its truest form, which is not property transferred, but understanding continued. Do you think there's someone out there, Alford said, right now, driving past the fence line and looking in? Kellum was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November wind moved through the windbreaks that Dwayne had planted in 1969, and that still stood on the northwest corners of three fields older and fuller now than Dwayne had ever seen them, doing the slow work of protection that trees do when no one is watching. I hope so, Kellum said. Good land deserves that kind of attention. Alford nodded. He picked up the folder for the current year, the one with his own handwriting on the tab, and he added the last entry of the season in the light of the desk lamp that had been Dwayne Honeycutt's desk lamp. And that still worked because Dwayne had bought things that lasted. The gray filing cabinet in the corner of that small room held 76 years of continuous observation of the same ground written by three different hands across three generations of men who had each in their own time, in their own way, understood the same thing: that land does not reward ownership. It rewards attention. And the attention has to be real, which means it has to be given when no one is watching and for longer than is comfortable, and without any guarantee that the ground will give anything back in the season you need it most. Kellum Yarro had learned this from Dwayne Honeycutt without ever being taught it directly, in the space between questions asked and answers given in the 20 minutes at a grain elevator in October of 1978, and the conversations that followed in the blue notebook he had carried for 4 years and finally placed in the top drawer of a gray cabinet on the morning he moved into a farmhouse he had spent 8 years earning the right to enter. He had known what he was working toward since he was 14 years old. He had not told a single person for 8 years, not because he was secretive, but because the kind of goal that takes 8 years to achieve requires a different kind of fuel than the approval of other people. It runs on something quieter and more reliable. It runs on the clarity of knowing exactly what you want and why, and on the patience to let the years between wanting and having be exactly as long as they need to be. The land always knows the difference between the person who comes to take from it and the person who comes to learn it. Dwayne Honeycutt knew the difference. Kellum Yarborough knew it. Alford Yarborough was learning it. And somewhere out on a county road in Fillmore County, Nebraska, on an afternoon in any given year, there may be someone on a bicycle or in a truck who stops at a fence line and looks at a piece of ground and feels something that is not quite wanting and not quite knowing, but is something in between, something that does not have a name in ordinary language, because it belongs to the part of a person that operates before language, the part that simply recognizes what it is looking at and begins quietly and without announcement to work toward it. That is where every story like this one begins. Not with a decision that anyone else can see, with a fence line, with a field, with the particular quality of attention that some people are capable of, and that the land, if you give it long enough, will always find a way to reward.